Okay, so here are the second half of the chapter 6 notes on the skin, and we'll pick up with accessory structures of the skin. This would be your fingernails and your hair, which are part of the integumentary system. So first off, we have fingernails and also your toenails. They're protective coverings on the end of your digits. They're formed the same way whether they're on your fingers or your toes. But basically on the outside, you have a nail plate. That's the part where you can paint or touch. And then you have the skin underneath that that's called the nail bed. And that's the part that if you ever get something stuck under your fingernail, like jammed under there, or if you hit your finger with a hammer, that's the part that has all the nerves in it that's going to be very sensitive underneath that nail plate. Now, if you look at the very base of your nail, you may have to push your cuticle back a little bit. You do have something called a lunula, and there's a picture on the next slide. It's called that because it's moon shaped, so lunula. It's at the very base, and that is where the mitotic region is. That's where the nail is actively growing, is in that little moon-shaped region. You have one on every single finger. It's just they're not always visible if your cuticle has grown up over it. Um, so that lunula is where the nail growth happens, and then it pushes the nail outward, distally towards your finger. The cells, in the nail become more and more keratinized, just like the skin as it goes through the layers of the epidermis, and the cells become flatter and flatter the further out they get, and until they die. So that very outer edge of the nail, the free edge, those are actually dead nails cells. Now, even though it's the same protein as in the rest of your skin, keratin, and it's also the same protein that's in your hair, same protein that's in hooves of like cows and horses, and some horns even, like a rhinoceros horn is made of keratin. It's the same protein, but depending on how those protein fibers are arranged will determine how strong or how weak that particular structure is. So like in the rhinoceros horn, the keratin is very thick and it's layered parallel, but then it has alternating layers that crisscross to give it extra strength. So same thing, the keratin of our nails is arranged in such a way that it's much, much stronger than the keratin in our skin or our hair. And here's a picture. Here's a cross section, so you can see this is the distal phalange here of the finger, and then this is adipose tissue that's around it. This would be the hypodermis here, and then here's your dermis, this redder layer, and then the epidermis is this thin white layer around the outside. But if you look face on, this is the lunula. Sorry, I just realized you need to see the pointer. So go back. Here is the distal phalange. It's a bone. Okay, here's the hypodermis with the fat cells. This part is the dermis, and then this part on the very outside edge is the epidermis. Here is the lunula. Okay, there's the free edge, the nail plate. The nail bed is underneath. Okay, it's where the epidermis would be. Okay, so next we have hair. Hair is found all over the body of every mammal. Even though we don't have fur, we humans don't have fur, we do still have hair all over, except for the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, your lips, your nipples, whether you're male or female, and then the external genitalia. Some parts of it are missing hair. Different people have different densities of hair follicles, so that's why some people are a little bit hairier than other people. But by and large, humans have a much lower density of hair follicles than other mammals, with the exception of cetaceans, whales and dolphins, and walruses and sea lions, seals. Okay, those have a lot less too for swimming. We have a lot less because we have more sweat glands and sweat glands, and sweat doesn't work to keep you cool if you're covered with fur. So each hair has a root, okay, and at the base of that, there's a hair follicle, and then that's where you have that mitotic layer, the cells at the base of the hair that are going through mitosis to create the hair. So it's only at the very base where you have actively growing hair cells. The rest of the hair, as it pushes out and away from the blood vessels, it dies off just like the rest of the skin. So that's why it doesn't hurt when you get a haircut. There's no nerves there, it's dead hairs. The hair follicles actually dip down into the dermis, and if it's a deep hair, maybe even into the adipose layer of the hypodermis. It just depends. But because it is so deep down, that is why it does hurt a little if you pluck a hair, if you pull it out, because it's down in the layer with all the nerve endings. So at the very base of the hair is the hair bulb, and then in the bulb itself is where the new cells are being formed. Old cells get pushed outward. They get more and more keratinized, just like with the nail, but the keratin is in a different structure, so hair is not as strong. And there are actually a few different structures of the keratin in the hair, and that's what leads people to have like straight or curly or wavy or kinky hair. It's how the keratin is arranged, and that's controlled genetically. We can alter it chemically, so you can get your hair straightened or permed or all kinds of treatments for it, but it won't remain that way as new hair grows in. The hair shaft is the part that you can see like as it's moving upwards. And again, once you can see your hair outside the body, it's dead. Okay, all those cells are dead and they're heavily keratinized. So here's a cross section. On this side, this is what a real tissue sample would look like. And here is a more cartoony version to make it a little bit easier to see. One of your practice assessments has this picture for you to label. Okay, but this part here above the skin, that's the hair shaft. Then it dips down through the epidermis, down into the dermis, and then just a little bit is sticking into the hypodermis, but down here is where you have the hair follicle. There's the hair bulb where you have the cell division going on. And then way deep down here, this is where the blood vessels are. So the blood vessels are supplying oxygen and nutrients to those hair cells. So it's only these cells that are well nourished, and that's what gives them the ability to go through cell division. As you move up, cells are dying because they're not getting any more oxygen or nutrients. Over here, we'll talk about these in a few slides. These are sebaceous glands. They secrete oils that help to lubricate the hairs. And then off to the side, these are some sweat glands. Here's what a hair cell, or excuse me, a hair looks like if you zoom way in. Okay, so this is a highly zoomed in image of a hair. Okay, so around here is the epidermis. So this is where the hair basically comes out of the skin. And then there's the shaft of the hair. And you can see it's not this smooth structure. Okay, you can see the individual cells basically making it up. Okay, so in addition to the hair like structure being controlled by genetics, also hair color. So it works the same way as skin color, basically. So there's melanin that's produced by melanocytes, same as in the skin. That's going to be responsible for most of the different hair colors, and they can range all the way from white to dark black. So white would be a complete lack of melanin, and then all the shades of like blonde, brown, and black hair are different quantities of melanin. However, there are two different kinds of melanin. There's eumelanin, which is darker. The EU means true melanin. and there's another kind called pheomelanin, which is a little bit different. It's like a reddish yellow. So people with red hair have a lot of this pheomelanin, and blonde hair, they have a little bit. Okay, and you can have mixtures of both within the hair. So some people can actually have, um, you could have a black hair, a blonde hair, a brown hair, red hair, white hair, all on the same head of a person. It just depends. So they might have melanocytes that are making all the different kinds. It's just in different places. If you're born with true albinism, you'll have white hair. That's like if you're an albino person. These are people that genetically, well, not just people, animals too can have albinism. They genetically have no pigmentation in their skin or hair or in their eyes. So there's a gene, they have a mutation that turns off all melanin production. So people with true albinism, and I've seen someone like this before, like in real life, they have, their skin is like the palest white, their hair is white, like from the time they're born, and their eyes are red because they have no pigmentation in their iris or at the back of their retina in the eye. So it's red because you can see the blood vessels in the eye. And if you've ever like been to a pet store, you probably can see the same thing in like rats and mice, how they have the red eyes. It's because they're albino. Um, Now, as people age, various factors make the melanocytes die off. A lot of them having to do with the immune system in the hair, and that's what turns an individual hair white because it's no longer making melanin. But if people have hairs that are still pigmented and some that are unpigmented, then we say they have gray hair. Like overall, like together, we say the person has gray hair, but they could, if they plucked an individual hair, it would be one white hair. Now on each hair, every single hair on your body, you have a little teeny tiny muscle cell called an erector pili muscle. It's a smooth muscle cell. You can't control it voluntarily. Um, but what it does is if it contracts, it pulls that hair upright, and that's what gives you goosebumps or goose pimples. So this happens naturally when you get too cold, your hair stands on end, and that allows the little hairs to trap a little tiny layer of air close to your body, so it'll keep you a little bit warmer. But it also will do this when you get upset or like spooked or freaked out. Um, you kind of see this if you have a pet, a dog or a cat. They, if they get scared, they might puff out their tail or like the hair on their back stands up. It's the same reaction in people. We just don't have fur, so you don't see it as much, but you will see the goosebumps. Okay. Now within the skin, you have various glands. So the definition of a gland is a tiny organ. Well, no, it's not always tiny. It's an organ in the body that makes a substance and then it secretes that substance elsewhere in the body. So for the skin glands, they all have a pore. They're attached to a pore by a duct, and then they release whatever it is they made, like out onto the outer surface of the body. You do also have internal glands, like your uh, pancreas functions as a gland. It makes enzymes to help you digest food, and then that secretes into your small intestine. So you have sebaceous glands, sweat glands, ceruminous glands, and mammary glands inside your skin. Sebaceous glands, they're a type of a holocrine gland. You don't have to focus on that so much. But when they make sebum, the entire cell gets filled with the sebum, and then the whole cell is released out onto the skin. These are next to hair follicles, like they're attached to the hair follicle. And sebum is kind of an oily substance, and it gets secreted onto the hair itself, and it waterproofs the hair and also moisturizes the hair and also the skin. And it helps the hair like to erupt from the skin without becoming ingrown or itchy. You also have sweat glands. Sometimes they're called sudoriferous glands. They're kind of a merocrine gland, and the difference here is that when they have a secretion, the cells on the end of the gland secrete that substance through exocytosis. So it's not the whole cell leaving onto the hair like with the sebaceous gland. It's just little vesicles within the cell go out through exocytosis. So the cells don't have to constantly be replaced. But you have two kinds of sweat glands. You have eccrine and apocrine. The eccrine type are the most common. They're the ones that help to keep you cool when you're too hot. So they make a lot of sweat, and you have them all over your body, but you have a lot on your forehead, your neck, and your back. So if you've ever been outside and done a lot of yard work, you'll notice your back gets sweaty, and then your head as well. The apocrine glands, these actually don't start functioning until puberty. The change in hormone level causes them to become active. But these are the ones that make you sweat when you're afraid or upset or in pain or during arousal. So you have a lot of them in the axilla, which is your armpits, and your groin. So if you've ever been super nervous about like a presentation or a date, something like that, anytime you've been upset, you'll notice that you'll get really sweaty under the armpit. You also have them in the groin too. The sweat in these has protein and fat. It's less watery than the sweat coming out of the eccrine glands. And because it has protein and fat, and they're located in the armpits and the groin, there's much more bacteria in those places, and the protein and the fat gives them something to eat. And it's the bacteria, once they've eaten those, their byproduct is body odor. So the bacteria actually release a stinky gas because of that. Now, the ceruminous glands and the mammary glands are actually a subcategory of sweat gland. They're modified sweat glands. Cerumen is a fancy word for wax. So the ceruminous glands are waxy glands. And what these are found in your ears. So they actually make wax in the ear canal to help trap any dust or pathogens that get into the ear to help protect it. Your ear is actually closed off. Like once you get inside, if you were to look in the ear, you would see the eardrum, the tympanic membrane. So it's closed off unless you've been injured from the rest of the outside world. But the wax stays in that outer part. Sometimes these can get a little overactive, or if someone's been putting Q-tips in their ears too much for too long, the wax can actually build up. Sometimes swimmers have this problem too, and you can actually get a wax plug in your ear. So if that happens, you have to go to a doctor, and they literally have a tool that's like a little miniature sandblaster, and it blasts the wax out of there. Mammary glands, these are only present in females. They secrete milk to nourish the baby. And it sounds really gross, but milk is just a modification of sweat. Um, it changes from day to day and baby to baby. The nipple is actually highly sensitive to the baby's mouth, the saliva, and everything. And that will trigger different a different composition in the milk depending on the baby's needs. So milk, there's water, there's some protein in it, there's sugar, lactose, there's antibodies. So if the baby's sick, the mother will make antibodies for the baby. See, protein, sugar, and fat. Okay. And this is the same picture we saw before. Okay, so now we're moving on to 6.4, functions of the skin. So it's a barrier. Its main function is for protection. It covers the entire body. It prevents anything pathogenic from getting into the body for the most part. And a pathogen is any microorganism, any teeny tiny critter that could cause disease. So that could be a virus, it could be a bacteria, it could be a fungal cell, it could be a protist like an amoeba or something. All of those in general, the skin keeps out. It helps our body maintain homeostasis through temperature regulation. So when you get too hot, you sweat. When you get too cold, your hair stands on end to help warm you up. Um, it keeps you from losing water because it provides that barrier. It is also where you have a lot of sensory receptors. You have pain nerve endings. You have deep pressure and light pressure. You have temperature sensors in there to help you sense where your body is in relation to the world. When you sweat, you do actually excrete some waste products out of your skin, urea, and your skin is responsible for making vitamin D. So your liver makes cholesterol. That's just what it does, one of the things that it does. And then the cholesterol eventually gets into your skin, and when you go out in the sunlight, UV radiation will interact with that cholesterol and chemically change it. It provides the energy to chemically change it into vitamin D. And you need vitamin D for your immune system and for you can't absorb calcium if you don't have enough vitamin D. So even if you're drinking tons of milk, if you're low on vitamin D, you won't have that to assist you. Um, okay. Now for temperature regulation, like our body temperature should stay around about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but not a whole lot, because 98.6 is considered the average. But if your temperature gets above 100 degrees or 101 degrees, which is really only like 2 to 3 degrees difference, we call that a high fever, and it's a problem, and you should go to the doctor, if not the hospital, depending on how long you've had it. If you get too hot, your brain will literally cook itself. All the proteins in your brain will start to unravel, and they're not doing the things they're supposed to be doing. They're dying off, and that would be a heat stroke. You could actually die from being too hot. So that's part of what we need the skin for, is to help keep us cool through sweating. We also, like, we produce a lot of body heat. Our skeletal muscles in particular, our liver and the heart, they make a ton of heat. So that's what maintains that 98.6. But if you get too hot, then you need to cool off. Okay. In addition to sweating, if you get too hot, your skin will, or the blood vessels in your dermis will actually dilate, which means they get wider and they'll push closer to the surface of the skin. So that way, because heat is carried in your bloodstream, so that way heat can get out quicker. So that's why people who are really hot, if you've been exercising a lot or you've been outside in the heat, why, especially if you have lighter skin, why they look pink or flushed, it's because their blood vessels are dilated in addition to the sweating. That's called hyperthermia. Thermia means temperature, and hyper is too much. On the opposite extreme, there's hypothermia. Hypo is too little. And that one you've probably heard of before because you see it on TV or in movies. We tend to have more of a problem here in Florida with hyperthermia, especially in the summer months when it gets to be over 90 degrees every day. So if you're outside for too long, you can have a heat stroke. And we do see a problem here with tourists that aren't used to that, especially since it's so humid in Florida that even if you do sweat, there's nowhere for it to go, so you stay hot. Hypothermia, it has the opposite effect. So you don't sweat at all because you don't want to get any cooler than what you are. And then instead of vasodilation, your blood vessels go through vasoconstriction. They get smaller and contract deeper down into the body to help keep the heat inside as much as possible. That's why people who are extremely hypothermic start to look blue as well. So like instead of red from the blood being there, they look blue because there's no blood in this, or not as much blood in the skin. Um, and then if it gets really bad, you'll start to shiver. That's involuntary when someone shivers, but the skeletal muscle will just contract over and over again because the skeletal muscle produces heat. All right, our final section in this chapter is on wound healing, which is when you have a cut or a bruise or a contusion. Okay. If you have a wound, that area is going to become inflamed. That's just a natural part of the healing process. So the blood vessels in that area will dilate and they'll also become permeable. So what that means is they'll dilate so that more and more blood can get into them quickly, bringing nutrients and immune system cells and antibodies, oxygen. And permeability means all that stuff can get out into the surrounding tissue. So the surrounding tissue will look red and swollen, but that's how it's supposed to look if you're injured. Um, if it's a superficial cut, by superficial we mean staying in the epidermis, basically, maybe even a little bit into the top part of the dermis, then the epithelial cells will reproduce, like in that stratum basal layer, they'll reproduce and fill in the area that's been injured. But a deep injury going way down into the dermis or even into the hypodermis requires a lot more um, active of a response from the body to repair it. And it's important that it gets repaired because remember, the skin is that protective layer. So if there's an opening in it, pathogens can get in. Just like if you, I don't know, if you're thinking about like in medieval times, you need a castle with a wall around it. If you have a break in the wall, the enemies can get in. Same thing. Okay. So the redness from inflammation is caused by the vasodilation, and then heat. If you actually touch a wound around it, it'll feel hotter than the surrounding area, and that's because of the extra heat coming in from the blood, but also there's a lot of like biochemistry going on. That's what metabolic activity is, that releases heat as well. You will also see swelling in the area because the blood is putting all kinds of extra fluids and things within that area. And then you'll also have pain at the site because any neurons, sensory neurons that were there, if they've been injured, they're going to be sending pain signals. But also, the area is swollen, so it's putting pressure on any nerves that aren't severed or injured. So they're going to also be sending pain signals. That edema is the scientific term for swelling. That's right there. So if it's a deep, deep wound, um, there will be bleeding just because there's all kinds of blood vessels all throughout your body. So the bleeding has to be stopped first. So that involves formation of a blood clot, and we'll go over the blood clotting process much more in depth when we get to the cardiovascular system. But the blood clot will form a scab to cover the wound if it's on the outside um, or on the inside, either way. Um, Then you have a special cell called a fibroblast that's going to go to that area and it's going to start making collagen fibers that'll cover the wound. Sort of like stitches, but they're naturally formed stitches. So after that happens, then you have phagocytic cells. These are cells that go through phagocytosis, which means they eat. They take it in something into themselves and eat it. So any dead tissue, any pathogens that are there, any debris, um, excess proteins, the phagocytic cells are going to take it in and digest it and get rid of it. And then at the last stage, any damaged tissue is going to be replaced with new tissue, and the scab is going to slough off or fall off, especially if it's on the outside, it'll just kind of fall off. If the wound is really deep or really bad, those collagen fibers may form like in excess, because the goal is for the body is to close the wound as fast as possible. So sometimes that'll lead to too much of the collagen fiber because it has to happen so quickly, and then that's going to leave what we call a scar. So if you have a larger wound, you're going to get a scar, and then the healing that comes with it, you'll get granulations around the scar. So you'll have a new branch of a blood vessel will grow into that area, and then that's going to bring in more fibroblasts. It's going to bring more collagen fibers to help repair the wound, and then all that structure will be broken down once the wound is healed. The blood vessels will get reabsorbed. They won't stay in that area. The fibroblasts will leave, but you'll have the scar of the collagen fibers left over. Okay. And then here's the stages. So this would be like if you stepped on a nail, it looks like. You'd have this wound, the blood clot would form at the top, and then you have the fibroblasts down here starting to secrete the collagen fibers. Macrophages are the cells that are going to clean up any dead cells or debris. You'll get the granulation there, more fibroblasts laying down collagen, and you get the extra blood vessels in here. And then most of this one is healed. You have the scab at the top that'll eventually fall off, and the epidermis has regenerated, and then you have scar tissue here. Some people are genetically predisposed to scar worse than others. So one of the skin disease projects is keloids. So whoever's doing that, like it goes directly with this. But keloids are when you have like excess scar tissue, basically. You have like bumps and things like that. Okay, and that is the end of the notes for chapter 6.